Good morning. Continuing the review and summary of the conclusion of Ayin Beis, Volume 3. We are on page closer to the top of page 1460. Explaining that this intensity of a rotze and simoyin, that's the words he uses, rotze as yearning, longing, in the context of rotze and shuv. Sometimes it's tension and resolution. Here, most fitting is rotze as a yearning, a longing, like from the word rotz, to run toward, and simoyin, a great thirst that develops in the soul when it feels the distance from Elokus. So we spoke about contemplating that all of existence is in a state of distance. But specifically, where do you feel it? And how we began this new paragraph is Masharotze enal mischadish b'neshama dafka lamata. Why does this get suddenly elicited or ignited in the soul, dafka, when it comes down below? It's because below, that's where the soul acutely feels this distance, due to the fact that richuk mitzad guf nefesh habamis. As I was explaining, and as we learned, that when neshama is in Gan Eden or even Atzilus, there it feels closeness to God. It doesn't feel distance. Obviously, if the neshama would really concentrate and contemplate, it could understand that everything is infinitely distant from Atzmos. But number one, it doesn't have to do so. And two, it doesn't feel it, so-called, in its very guts. But when it comes down below, the soul does feel that, because the soul is concealed in the Guf Nefesh Habamis. And even at Tzaddik, he said, Tzaddik ain't Tzaddik Baruch Asher Yasa Teva La Yechta, from the words Chesodin, that there is a concealment even in a Tzaddik, and especially due to the fact that the Nefesh Habamis is active, like he says, in this world, we're dependent on physical matters. Even a tzaddik, God forbid, can get not well and need a doctor. And the same thing with hunger and thirst. So Yoni Haguf affect the neshama down below. And especially if someone is drawn toward physical matters. And then there's the helam of the world in general. All of that contributes to a state of distance from Elokus. So when a neshama feels that, and with the contemplation of that distance, and then comes to understand as well, like he says, that, I'm sorry, before we get to the contemplation on the rest of Ashtalshlus, he says, so all that is, Zehu Ascholas Sibas Arotze. So you see clearly, Ascholas Sibas Arotze means that's the spark, so to speak, the catalyst that causes the Rotze from the distance of El Matachn Guvan Nefesh. He's very uncomfortable, very does not feel good at all from being in this distant place, Eretz Sia Vishmama, in a parched or arid and desolate land of this world that's doing all this concealment, that doesn't have Gili Alikus, but Guvan Nefesh Bamis Mailimim Mastirim. Those are the words he uses. Now that he's already in that state, which is not the case when the Neshama is Lamaila, through this, he also comes to understand that also the Elemis Al Yenim, in truth, compared to Atzmus, are also really in a state of Tzia Vishmama, L'gaba Atzmus. That was the first thing. Then he added V'gam Yashlemer. We could add as well, additionally, we can say that Ein Arech Lecha, what we learned earlier, Ein Arech Lecha is Dafke Ne'elam Hazeh. That Ein Arech, that infinite distance, you only feel in the Yesh and Mitzias of this world. That's where you feel the Ein Arech. In Atzilus, Yashlemer, the Batzilus, Ein Shaykh Ein Arech. Inyan Ein Arech. Why? Because Atzilus is Gilead Helam. Atzilus is revealing divine attributes. Chesed, Gvura, Chachma, Bina, Das, Chesed, Gvura, Teferes. That's what Atzilus is. All about the divine attributes. It's true that in truth it's also Ein Arech, but that's not what Atzilus experiences. There it feels its connection to the source, and it's actually expression. So there you could say Ein Zo Losecha. That Atzilus experience that there's no other but Elikus, but not Ein Arech, not infinite distance. And this also applies, he said, not just to the Oiris of Atzilus, but also the Kalim are also Elikus. And though it says Chochma Ma'ayin Timotza, the Chochma does sense that it comes from Ayin, not Gilead Helam, but a form of Ayesh and Ayin. He says, but it's not real Yesh Ma'ayin. It's more like one thing extrapolating from another. It, as Chachma recognizes that it comes from a higher place, but it's not quite the distance of Yesh Ma'ayin like the Nivraim, especially in this world. Yesh Mitzias. So bottom line is, in Atzilus, Ein Shayach Hasaga de Ein Arech. That's only that comprehension of that infinite distance is only Lamata Dafke. And also from that we also derive that the Oid is also Ein Arech. And that's why Dafke, when the Neshama comes down below, there you have this contemplation, and that causes that intense Rotzeh with Simoyim B'Yeser. The intense and increasing yearning and longing and thirst, which causes the Ava, not just loving God, but loving God b'chol ma'adecha in a form of bli gvul. Dafke the neshama lamata. Yeah, and that's where we stop. That's around six. How many lines? Around 6 lines from the top, or 7. Let me see. 3, 4, 8 lines from the top of page 1460. So let's continue now. On that line, lamata, on page 1460. And you can follow, if you want to follow the text, go to ayinbeis.com. He says, V'hinei, and now, Midbar de Kedusha, remember we're talking about Midbar of Kedusha, which is this intense thirst and longing. Nikra Midbar Sinai. So before he just talked about Midbar. The Midbar, it's a wilderness. Wilderness in the Umazeh is, of course, no gili at all. It's a concealment. In Kedusha, it's the great thirst that's caused in a state when you don't feel the gili. So he says now it's called Midbar Sinai. Just a moment. Yeah. He's going to focus now. Why is it called Sinai? Now, we know there are other wildernesses in the world and deserts, but of course, the most prominent midbar is the midbar that the Jews traveled through for 40 years, which was the midbar Sinai wilderness or Sinai desert. So there's a reason it's called Sinai, and for the record, the Maimer from the Alter Rebbe, which some of this is based on, he's still going to actually quote the Alter Rebbe's Maimer, is on Midbar Sinai in the beginning of Sefer Bamidbar. And that is where, so he's going to explain now why he called it Sinai. So the Chazal say that what does Sinai mean? Sinai has different meanings. One of them, it comes from the word sina, from the word hatred, despise. Even though Sinai is with a samach and sina is with a sin, but nevertheless, the Chazal associate the two. So the expression the Chazal is that on Sinai, when Hashem chose the Jewish people from Matan Torah, so you're the Sinai on everything the opposite. He chose good, but also unchose, so to speak. We say unchose is not the right word. But just like there's love to one thing, so you then dislike everything that's the opposite. So that's the expression, Shemezeh Yarda Sina Alara. That caused there should be Sinai Alara. So you could say, what happened before Sinai? God did like Ra? No. But before Sinai, there wasn't yet the clear delineation of Teva and Ra, because the nations of the world and the Jewish people was all mixed together. But by Matan Torah and Sinai, that's where it was very clear. This is when the Eibishter gave the Torah. This is what he wants. This is what Torah says is allowed. This is what's prohibited. So even though the Ovis kept the Torah before Matan Torah, but that was not formal. The formal distinction of Hamaisa Sheyasin Ve'ela Shaleita Sena. This is what you're supposed to do. This is what you're not supposed to do. Came at Sinai. because Sinai made a very clear distinction between the two. So Yard the Sin al Hara. What's the connection to what we're talking about here? So he's going to say, the kasher hu b'chinas teikav adotze v'atzimoyin. So he's going to explain, the Midbar leads to Sinai. When a person has, due to the distance, and they feel the thirst, because there's no water, we're living in a world where the lakus is not revealed. So this teikav adotze v'atzimoyin, this intense yearning or longing and thirst, la'erein sof baruch hu, to the infinite divine, which is what you're longing for. So it's very distressed when a person comes to that, when you're sensing the thirst. We're not talking about if you don't sense the thirst and you're comfortable in this world. Obviously, we're not talking about that. But a person is in a midbar physically, and at some point you realize there's no water. It's a parched land. There's nowhere. So you feel an intense thirst. That means that it's salamed, there's a deep distress. In this case, the thirst is not a physical thirst, it's a ruchnistic thirst. So he's distressed very much from his animal soul, which is in a state of concealing. It's in an arid and in a desolate state. And it conceals and covers up on godliness. So there's not just a feeling of thirst, it's also the feeling of distress. You're feeling a sina, like he's going to soon explain. And that brings him to despise this ra. What's ra? Again, ra, not just evil. The evil that's concealing the good. That's concealing the goodness of Elokus. So in this context, this concealment is called ra. And so therefore that's distressing him terribly. And that's called sina betachlis. Sina sara betachlis. So Commissioner Kosev, Oyev Hashem, sina ra. Those that love God despise evil. So it's explained in a number of places in Chassidus that it's commensurate to one another. The more you love something, the more you despise its opposite. In Perek Yud in Tanya, where he talks about the tzaddik, the two levels of a tzaddik, so that he says that makes that very clear, that point. When you love something deep, if you don't love something very deeply, you're also not going to, that the feelings of rejection of the opposite are also not going to be that intense. But the more you connect to something, the more you want to protect it from anything that's opposite of it. Take even, let's say, God forbid, in a situation where there's danger to your family, to your children. The love of your children, the love of your family is so intense that you're going to do everything possible to fight any enemy. So there's two ways, therefore, your love is expressed. One is directly loving something and feeling it, but also rejecting absolutely and unequivocally anything that's dangerous to that connection. So in this context, what is this world? What does the Midbar Sea of Ishmama create? A deep thirst, and therefore a despise to everything that doesn't allow a lakus to be revealed. Someone once asked the Rebbe in a Yechidus why he's so passionate about Mashiach. No, there are a lot of things to talk about, but when it comes to Mashiach, he's so passionate and he cries, and he's like a sense of urgency in a very, very emotional way. So the Rebbe responded to him, Golus is a machla. Golus is an illness. It's not just that God is concealed. It's an illness. It's an aberration from what is healthy. And therefore, when you really recognize that, you do everything possible to fight it. It's not just another subject matter, another important thing. It's life and death, so to speak. I'm adding that. The Rebbe didn't use those words. So when you recognize that Gilead Lakus is your very life, it's your oxygen, and anything that conceals that is not letting the flow of oxygen, tell me, how would you react? How would a person, God forbid, react if you're unable to breathe? Or there's some impediment that's not letting the oxygen flow. We do everything possible. We become desperate, actually. So that's what he's calling Seiner Ra. We're not talking about now, this is important to emphasize, we're not talking about hatred. Usually you talk about hatred, it's a very negative thing. We shouldn't hate. We shouldn't despise. But here, it's not hatred in that sense. Here, it's just rejecting in a very absolute way, anything that's opposite to Gilui and Elikus. So obviously, the more you feel that thirst, the more you feel the importance of Elikus, the more you're going to despise using that word here. So just keep in mind that words matter. This is not, shouldn't be confused with what the hatred we see out there. People hate, unfortunately, other human beings, and they express that hatred and so on. This is more, obviously, in a level of Elikus versus the antithesis to Elikus. It's like hating Golus, not just rejecting it, but hating it. Maybe there's a better word in English that we can find instead of hatred, despise, rejection. But that's the words that come to mind, because that's usually the word when we say sinna. But there may be a word that is like not a positive form of hatred, but a hatred towards something that deserves to be hated.
Loathsomeness?
To loathe. Well, it's another word. Loathe is similar to hate. I don't know if it changes it, but these are all, yeah. Okay. The tachlis sina sonesim. That's also an expression. This brings that in Tanya in chapter 32 at the end. That I utterly sina sonesim. I hate them with utter hatred. He's talking here about the wicked and about the cruel and so on. So it's not a personal hatred, it's a hatred towards everything that is the opposite of godliness and goodness. U'kamesha kosav. And he's bringing the pasuk we learned earlier, previous page, the Evim Gam Tzmeim. So in that pasuk, the Evim Gam Tzmeim, they're hungry and also thirsty. Vayitzaku al Hashem b'tzar lehem. And they cried out to God because they were distressed. B'tzar, tzar from the word, not tzar, pain, but tzar is also the word like meitzar. They feel confined, like trapped. Like, yeah, we say, yeah, but being distressed, they had samoy and nasa tzaik gdela, because the thirst creates a great cry, shetzarle mahara, that he's pained or that he's distressed by the ra. The ra here in the context of concealing the divine or the lack of oxygen, basically spiritual oxygen. Chayenu ve'erich yemenu. Okay, so he added now why it's called Sinai. Fine, but now there's another aspect to thirst. If you remember, he spoke earlier that Midbar calls from Yesed Ha'esh, fire dries things up. So intense fire. So though in the Midbar it's not necessarily a fire, but the heat, the extreme heat, creates the dryness. What he said before about the Eish. On the other hand, a great thirst is also very fiery, like we said. Simoyin b'dish be'esh. You feel a fiery passion of. So he's now going to say like this: Va'esh vat simoyin, and the esh could say the extreme heat and thirst. So heat can be a heat that causes things to be very dry, but also heat can also create a passion. Passion is also associated with heat. So this esh with simoyin. Once that's now developed, so even though it's coming from a place because you feel the emptiness, you feel the distance, you feel the distress of being so far away from Elikus, or I'll use the example, not being terribly thirsty, to the point that you're like so, he said before, the hoarse throat, the same thing, you're terribly thirsty, and you feel that emptiness in a very passionate way. So now, interestingly, that itself becomes a force. It's not just a negative. It's not just as a result, someone thirsty you think is a negative. He says that indeed actually is a springboard. Who seder for machles hara? It has another element. It has an element that it consumes. It burns and consumes the ra. There's an interesting twist here. So till now we're talking about that it causes a person to long and to be passionate and want and to long to connect to Elikus. But now he's saying the very passion itself that has been evoked by the thirst and by the emptiness, by the desolation and the tsar and the distress, that in turn creates a fire in the soul that burns and consumes the ra, the nefesh habamis of the animal soul, b'bchinas ishapche chasheichel nehera, v'lo rak b'chinas iskafia b'lavad. To the extent that it actually, when something burns, what happens? It actually transforms the very object when you burn something. Iskafia is you're avoiding it. That's called abstinence. You're abstaining from it. So that means you don't want to get close to any ra, you just stay away from it. Isapche is you're actually transforming it. So he's saying now this fiery passion that's coming from actually a lack of, in turn becomes a force that affects the nefesh habamis to the point of isapche. Now, I think he's going to speak about it in the parentheses, the last parentheses in this paragraph. But before he does, I just want to say, most likely he's going to be quoting similar to what we learned in Hagmagbiya L'Sheves. What did he say right at the beginning of the Maimer? That how does the nefesh halikis affect the nefesh habamis? By Shema. Now we know it's also with the siyua, the support of Birchas Yetzer of the Malachim. When the nefesh habam, it contemplates on Hashem Echad, how everything is all part of the divine and originates from the divine, that has an impact on the animal soul, especially after it's been warmed up, so to speak, and softened by the hisbonenus of the malachim, which is the root of the animal soul, to the point that it causes it to have a haftas Hashem Elokecha b'chol levavcha, excuse me, b'shnei yitzarecha. So it causes that the nefesh habamis should be affected by this passionate love. Remember, let's go back to the example of the ner. The wick is the nefesh halikis inserted in the oil, which is the seichel of the nefesh habamis, which on its own follows its own interests, material interests for its own survival. But through these bonus, what happens? The oil becomes a fuel that gets absorbed and drawn into the wick, and in turn creates a flame. What's the flame? The fiery passion, like here, flame of ner Hashem nishmas adam, of ahaftas Hashem lekecha. Not just avoiding, it's not just ignoring the animal soul. It's transforming a chol levavcha, that with both sides of the heart, the right and left side, b'shnei yitzarecha, which means both sides of the heart, are both loving God. So nefesh habamis is affected by the contemplation, and furthermore, it's affected by the passion. I gave the example earlier when we spoke about this. When you see somebody davening, for example, pouring their heart out. So even though initially you're not on that level, it's hard to ignore. It affects you. The very scene, the very experience of seeing someone really passionate can in turn stimulate passion within you. So in a sense, the nefesh habamis, after Birchas Yetzer, after the davening that led to, and there's also Psukkah de Zimra, which weeds out the weeds, from the word Zimra, lezamer aritzim, as we learned, to get rid of the weeds. So then the nefesh habamis is ready to be affected by the passion of the nefesh halikis. And where's the nefesh halikis getting passion from? So it's these abundance and godliness, but also, and primarily it begins with the catalyst, what ignites it is the tzemoyen that comes from the distance. So nefesh halikis is feeling distress. At the same time, that's causing it to loving and wanting godliness, a tshuka, what he called a rotzei and a tzemoyen. And that in turn, that passion, like a fiery passion, also burns up the ra to the point that it transforms it too into v'haftas Hashem Elokecha. So you can see he's already, even though he's not quoting the Maimer exactly, but it's connected to that idea, which is such a central theme, especially here in this section in Ayin Beis, as we've been discussing. But I think in the parentheses, he's going to spell it out a bit more. So all this is what Midbar of Gedusha is. So Midbar of Gedusha is coming from the concealment, which in turn creates this tremendous longing and thirst, and a thirst at the point of a fiery passion that to the point that you completely despise and let's say loathe or reject entirely Ra, but that fiery passion continues and ultimately impacts the Ra to transform it, to transform the Nefesh Habamis, and not just to avoid it, and not just to ignore it, not just to avoid it and abstain from it. So the parentheses is going to elaborate a bit more, but let me stop if anybody wants to ask anything. Ukiyadua, parentheses, the al yidea ava shal pitam v'das, known through ava al pitam v'das, which means that's more of a rational love. Where you contemplate, for example, that God created you, that God is giving you life, is giving you sustenance. It's al pitam v'das. It's not super rational. So it makes sense. It's like appreciating and loving something that's helping you. That's one example of tam v'das. So pitam v'das nasa b'chinas iskafia levad. That ava, even though it is a love, but it's only iskafia. Means you're not transforming anything that's antithetical to God, or antithetical, let's use a human example. You love someone for logical reasons. They helped you, they support you, they are a friend of yours. So that iskafia, you're going to make sure to avoid anything that disturbs that love and anything that's antithetical to it. But iskafia bulvad. Shigam nefesh habamis neseirer ba'ava, which can cause that the nefesh habamis should also be stimulated or aroused with love. Like I quoted before. Like it says, love Hashem with both sides of the heart. So on one level, the initial level of Ava, Alpitam Vedas, it's only a form of iskafia from the word kfiyah, kaifa. Kaifa means you're subduing the nefesh habamis. You're not transforming it. So he's saying that too can be called a Ava, because the nefesh habamis is not disturbing your love, and you're not allowing the nefesh habamis' negative impulses to affect. But it's only iskafia. Ke'enim is batla dayim be'etzem mahusei. The nefesh habamis has not been nullified in its very core. You're not transformed it. You're keeping it at bay. You're keeping it under control. Like in Tanya, when he explains what a Beinani is, Mayach Shal Talev, you're not changing the Nefesh Habam. Nefesh Habamis is still active. Like in the example he gives in chapter 9 in Tanya, like a battle. So the one king is dominating over the other, over his enemy, but he's not eliminated it. So he's in control of the thought, speech, and action. You're in control over your thought, speech, and action. But the Nefesh Habamis is active. You constantly have to suppress it. That's another good word here, suppress. So you suppress it, but it's not mizbatel betzem mohusei. What would be mizbatel if you can convert the enemy to become your ally? Then it's a whole other story. And this is what happens. But then there's another level of ava, not al pitam v'das, but ava rabba, shalamayla mitam v'das. This is already an ava that comes more from the atzmizdika connection, not one that's based on a rational contemplation. That causes the animal soul, more than iskafia, more than suppressing or subduing it, but transformation. Shemizbatel be'etzem mahusei. That its etzem mahus should be transformed. Like when you burn something, let's say you burn something that initially was something that you didn't want. That very object becomes also part of the fuel of the fire. That's called transformation. Rabbi Rashab is giving some details, and it makes sense because especially if it's based on the Magbi, the Sheves, the Maimer, so these details are all part of the process of how the Nefesh Elikis affects the Nefesh Habamis. Interesting thing in Torah, and I think even the Mittler Rebbe, if I recall correctly, Maimer, he doesn't talk about Iskaf and Isapche. And maybe I have to check the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer. Torah for sure not. But here the Rebbe Rashab is adding some points that add to the whole process, the steps. So he says, Ube'emes now, next point. In truth, Zeu la'achesh That the truth is, you can't just jump to Ava Rabba, to Sapche, if you don't first go through the first step. Which to me sounds very much like he's explaining the Torah, the Alter Rebbe's Maimer. Because there he just talks about ultimately transforming the fuel, the oil, into fuel that feeds the fire of the love of Hashem. That's his sapcha, most likely. So maybe that's why he's saying Ube'emes. To really get there, however, you have to go through the birur from the Avesh al Pitam V'das, the first level. In other words, first you have to suppress before you transform, basically. The B'chinas Iskafia. That has to come first. Then afterwards, through the Avarabba, you come to the level of Isapcha. Which is also, let's go back to the example in Tanya. Two nations, two empires are fighting a war. Okay, one of them ultimately wins. Now, winning does not mean that you've eliminated the enemy entirely. You control the city, like he calls it there, Irktana Ze'aguf, the body in the moral. You control the city. But we also know when a war ends, there are always pockets of resistance. Even those that are not resisting, but you know they're not your friends, they've just been conquered. So they surrendered. But they can make trouble anytime, and you have to always be on guard and vigilant. You haven't transformed them. You've subdued them. So you can't transform before you subdue. First you have to win. Then hopefully you can now convince them that it's in their favor and their benefit to become your ally, to become your friend, and that's possible. But basically, you can't get to step 2 of transformation if you don't first suppress, when you're talking about an enemy, of course. So that's what he's saying here. One more point that Rebbe Rashab adds. Elsewhere it's explained. The ba'ava shal pitam v'das, the lower level of ava, the more rational type of ava, ma'acheshu mashalev makil, being that the heart can contain it, because it makes sense. So it's not overwhelming the heart. The heart makil can contain it because it's a lower level of ava. Lo nasi sapche. So there's another place that explains why taka doesn't cause a sapche, because it's a lower level of ava that the heart can contain. So the heart can be affected by it, but it doesn't transform the heart. Ava Rabba is an intense, a passionate longing. She'ena lev makil esa ava. It overwhelms the heart. It's like overpowering. Not overpowering in the sense of suppressing, but overpowering that is so passionate. That's what causes the person to actually transform, and hatva means to go out of its natural parameters. I'll explain what this means. In a state of transforming darkness to light. We actually talked about this a lot earlier when he spoke about mutva, murgish, and muskul. So, a few lines of explanation here. We all are human beings are wired with certain structure, both our minds and our emotions. But we're going to talk about emotions more. So we learned that there's mutva, murgish, muskul. You're born with a certain natural inclinations, reflexive, natural, impulsive. I'm not talking about what's developed or acquired through life. Simply a newborn child. A child is ingrained in them that when they're in pain or hungry, they start crying. That's an emotional reaction. It's a call for help, basically. As the child grows older, and you can begin to reason with the child, and the child itself begins to understand, so its emotions become more refined. They're not as impulsive and reflexive as we've learned. As you grow older and you mature, and the mind develops, the mind begins also training and priming, if you wish, the heart, the emotions, to become also more sublime, more refined, not just follow every whim. One of the reasons until bar mitzvah, a person doesn't put on tefillin, because the child does not have self-control yet. By bar mitzvah, the moichin have come to a point, the beginning of maturity, to begin to control the emotions. And as we grow older, that's what real maturity is. Maturity is not just chronological, that you grow physically taller and develop physically, but also emotionally develop. You're an emotionally more developed person, a more emotional intelligence. And that intelligence is, that emotional side of us is defined by, or guided by, I should say, guided by the mind. That's a healthy, mature person. So a young child, you go over to a young child and you do something, you like take away their toy, or you insult them, very often they will reciprocate with an emotional outburst, a tantrum, or whatever it may be. That's a child. An adult, if an adult is, God forbid, insulted or someone hurts the adult, I'm not talking about a dangerous situation where you have to react. So your moichin, your gadlus ha-moichin, your maturity, is moich shalta lev. You don't express right away your dislike. I mean, the way it's supposed to be. I know many adults are just like children, and they just control themselves because or some don't even control themselves because it doesn't pass. It's not fitting to just have a tantrum in the middle of the street. But the way a person actually matures, certain things are not going to bother you, or your mind will tell you this is not. It's a petty thing, and I'm not going to be bothered by this. But this still does not mean you've gone out of your emotional wiring. What you've done is you've learned to tame it. You've learned to allow it to be refined. But then there's a whole other level, as we learned earlier, mutva murgish muska, where you're actually, with emotions, if you recall when he spoke about Eim revetzes ala frechim, bashiluch hakan, that the mother hovers over her efrechim, her fledglings, her newborns. So that's in the early stages. That's the aim, is bina, seichel, so-called nurturing the midas. That's the efrechim. But then once they grow old enough and they mature enough, it says the efrechim then, shalach to shalach ha'se'im, they propel the bina, the seichel, to go back to chachma, all the way back to, if you remember, to gaze at arich and atik, and reconnect all the way to the source. So in other words, there comes a point where the emotions become part of the process. Like here, v'haftas Hashem l'kecha b'chol levavcha b'shnei yitzarecha. There we didn't discuss nefesh habamis necessarily, but the emotions. But then there comes one more point. Can the emotions actually experience something that's beyond their parameters? So till now we've been talking, like he said, av al pitam v'das. So there you can guide the emotions. You could train a person. You don't just have a tantrum. I'm just using that as a simple example. You say thank you. You show gratitude, civility. An emotionally healthy person. But that's all within the parameters of the emotions. Can you go to a point of going out of those parameters? That's called yitzia mahatva. That can only happen when you get to a level of love that he says, avarabba, that's so passionate, that so-called overwhelms the lev. It's like he says here, makal and asa'ava. It's like you fill up a cup. So it says should be mali v'gadish. Don't just fill the cup, but it should spill over. And that spillover has another effect on the heart. In this case, the heart of the animal soul, the yitzarecha, that should be actually transformed. So the first level is more or less training, taming, and it's a level of subduing, but also guiding the heart to follow the nefesh halakis. The second level, this is what he says, but Mokamachid, it says, Mokamachid, that the avas, or the avarabba, but to take a varotze is so powerful that it actually causes a person's midas to be transformed, or what he calls yitzia ma'atva, to go out of their regular parameters. So you would, naturally, the emotions would go only that far, but this avarabba causes it to go much further, much higher. Now, he doesn't elaborate here, but in some places, if you remember in Torah, he does say that actually the nefesh habamis serves, that propels and adds avarabba to the nefesh halakis that it wouldn't have on its own. He doesn't say that explicitly here. Maybe he will say it soon, but he did say it a few pages back, because because dafka the neshama comes down below. that all this takes place. So interestingly, the nefesh abamis becomes the fuel. The wick itself only burns very little. The wick would burn out very quickly if it didn't have oil. So the real oil that really feeds the fire, in this case, the fiery passion of love, is coming from the nefesh abamis. That's when it's already in a state of, clearly in a state of ishapcha. Not just that it's cooperating, that it's actually feeding. You can say two levels there, too, iskafin ishapcha maybe, but definitely when it gets transformed in that level, it begins to feed. And that's coming dafka below. The neshama above doesn't have a nefesh abamis to contend with. So therefore, the nefesh abamis, the resistance, ends up becoming a tremendous ally that actually propels the neshama to a whole other level of avarabba and avabetainugim, lishtaba, begufa demalka, like we learned. And he says it explicitly in the Maimer and Teireh and Makbil Shevis, because nefesh abamis is rooted in toihu, the intense energies of toihu. When they're not tamed, they can be very destructive ultimately. But when they're tamed, they can add when they're harnessed, I should say. When they're harnessed, they can actually feed. Raf tvuz b'koyach sheir is the expression that the sheir, the animal, can produce a lot more tfuah, a lot more produce than a human being because it's so strong. So nefesh abamis, and it can add to the intensity of the fiery passion even more than the nefesh alikis would achieve on its own. He doesn't say that explicitly. I'm not sure why. It seems to fit here, but it could be he'll say it afterwards. He definitely said it before. It definitely fits into the whole big picture. So I just wanted to add that into the equation. And with that, we conclude this paragraph. So let me take any questions if there are any. Yeah.
I have a couple questions. The first is, and they both come to get a better understanding of the word makil, contain. So I understand that it's more hiskafia and sort of to resist. The heart resists the evil, but also the root is keli. It literally contains it, so it causes the heart to contain it, and not in the sense of subjugation, but in the sense of essentially drawing it in. If that's what a container holds something, so that to me is.
But
Uh-huh.
but that's not what he's saying.
Well, that's why I'm asking the question, because he uses the word makil, and that's
Because anything that's relative that could be contained, could be a keli, is only going to be the oyer that fits into the keli, and that oyer is not a transformative one. It's a more of a, like I said, a
in parody. Yeah,
or the what I used before the word to submit, to not submit. What was the word I used? Whatever the word.
I was
That's
busy
what he
typing.
means here.
Yeah.
So yes, it's fine. You can say it's a container, but it doesn't mean that it's transformed. It's still what it is, but it's now serving the role
Oh,
of.
I understand. I'm not even getting to hisabcha. I'm just focusing on makil and iskafia. And
Anyway,
to me,
makil, I would use the word contain. Does it have the word keli in it? Maybe, maybe not. I'm not sure. But contain would be the right word, and a keli contains the oil. If you want to use that analogy, I don't know if I would use that analogy,
right, but we're talking about containing ra, not or.
but we're not. But that's why I wouldn't use the word keli. I would
Uh-huh.
use makil, and he's not talking about ra containing. He said the lev contains the heart,
No, I'm talking. What is being contained? Uh,
the
the
love of
dark.
God, the love of God.
Oh, okay. I misunderstood then. It's not iskafia. I
That
thought
is
it was referring
iskafia. That love of God causes it to be subdued or um, yeah.
subjugated. Okay, I think you've given me clarity. I mean, I'm still a little confused, but I don't want to hold up the class. And the other thing is, I mean, I don't think this is correct, but what comes to mind when I hear the word makil is kilion, that the heart nullifies or neutralizes the evil.
Yeah, but that's not correct.
Yeah. Hmm. Okay. So etymologically, there's no connection between.
Not that
Um,
I know of.
uh-huh. Okay. I didn't think so, but it just came to mind.
Are there any other questions? Okay. Okay, so to sum up, what have we learned? We've learned a lot of steps here. That the midbar of Kedusha is the great thirst, the great longing, which is stimulated by the distance of being in a Eretz Sia V'Shmama, a desolate land where Elikus is concealed, to the point that you actually despise it, which adds to the passion, obviously, because you so passionately need oxygen, or in this case, divine oxygen and water. That in turn helps you come to understand that all of the Olamis are really in a state of desolation compared to Atzmus, but they wouldn't know it on their own quite the way we know it down here, Lamata. And this passion in turn, also, that's the Midbar Sinai, that passion in turn creates a fiery thirst that in turn affects the Nefesh Habamis, first in the state of Iskafia, to control, to subdue it. Uh, I don't want to use the word to contain it because that would confuse it with makil, but to subdue it. And then, after that, to the state of Isapche, where it actually transforms it. Now, before the parentheses, he only spoke about Isapche Chashech al like a fire that actually burns and transforms the object that it is consuming. Like in the case of the oil, the candle is actually being consumed as it's drawn into the psila and turning into what? The eish of Ahaftas Hashem Elikach. And the parentheses, he explained the two stages. The two levels of love. One is Aval Pitam Vadas, which earlier, just for the record, was more like B'chol Levavcha. Then there's B'chol Nafshecha, which was already a form of Mesiras Nefesh, then B'chol Ma'idecha. Here he doesn't use those terms, but most likely it's associated with that because that's all Vahafta has, all those levels. Here he talks about two of them. So earlier he did say B'chol Ma'idecha is the Rotzei B'li Gvul. That's clearly the highest level. Like that's like what he calls Avarabba, that is in a form of extreme passion that transforms. But the lower levels, B'chol Levavcha, Chol Nafshecha, well, especially B'chol Levavcha, Shnei Yitzarecha, could also mean the lower level of love that comes from Tam V'das, and that affects the animal soul, but not yet to a form of transformation. It's a form of subduing, of refraining, of controlling it. And that needs to come first. And once you have that, then afterwards you can come to the Avarah. But that's why first comes B'chol Levavcha, B'chol Nafshecha, then B'chol Ma'idecha. And then finally, the final piece is because the love that is Apitam Vadas is more of a love that is commensurate to the animal soul, to the lev, I should say, so it doesn't transform it. And Avarabba is an overwhelming love that actually transforms it. I think in chapter 9 in Tanya, when he speaks about the transformation, he says that it's like spills over from the right side of the heart where the Nefesh Elikis resides. The love is so intense, it spills over into the left side of the heart, which would be seemingly this higher level that is of transformation. I want to look it up there. It could be that he may even hint to these two levels in Tanya. Doesn't cite Tanya here, but it could be connected. One more point I'd make as an example. Chassidus brings this in different context. When a teacher is teaching students, so there's a few things going on, more than a few, but a few key dynamics. A good teacher will convey an idea in a way that the students obviously can understand. If you just blow them away with overwhelming ideas, no matter how brilliant it is, and they can't be maculate, they can't contain it, then the teacher has not done the job. On the other hand, a good teacher will also, or I should, before the other hand, and that consists of being mitzamtzim, so-called tailoring, diminishing, or I would say mostly customizing the flow of the ideas commensurate to the kelim of the students. So there's an act of restraint there, but with doing that, what happens is the students can understand the idea. But are the students transformed? So Chassidus says what a teacher will do to be mechadet is the expression sometimes, to sharpen the minds of the students, will always leave them something that's over their heads, that they cannot be makel, that may be even a little overwhelming. In addition, obviously, like we said here, you don't begin only with that, or else you're not teaching an idea. But we'll leave at the end something above their heads. And the point of that is not just to show them there's more to this, but actually that itself has the quality, the virtue of actually refining them. The challenge that they don't get it yet. Because when you understand something, it could take effort and yigia and exertion to understand it. But when you're left with the frustration that there's something you don't get, it actually, what it does is it helps refine your mind. It's like when you carve something, and sometimes you really need to break through resistance. You need to you need to be more intense. It's like you're using a stronger flame just to soften up the resistance. But that's not the flame you use all the time. Like when you kasha something, you have to turn white hot, to white hot, whatever it's called. Because you want to overwhelm it. So there's an element that the overwhelming, actually, that creates more transformation than the containment that they do contain. And you need both. They work together, obviously, hand in hand. So it's two elements. So in a sense, that's in seichel. The same thing you can apply to midas, like you're saying here, ava. There's an ava that the heart can contain, the heart can appreciate and understand. Even the nefesh habahamis can understand. Hashem blessed you with parnasa. Hashem blessed you with food. So you should bench. Say thank you. It's not something that's impossible. It's not overwhelming. It's not something beyond the capacity of a heart to contain. So that's one side. And then there are things where the emotions experience something that's somewhat overwhelming. And that passion that comes from the nefesh elokis has a power to actually shift. If you remember what he called hazaza, a shift, a change that can actually transform, like I said with the student, in a way that the first level would not achieve. Because the first level, the student understands it, and they're very satisfied in a way. Here, there's something lacking, and that causes them to want more, and wanting more absolutely allow them to like he said, to yitzia mahatva, to go out of their nature and go beyond their usual parameters and capacity. Just wanted to add that for explanation purposes. Okay.
Can you take another question?
Yeah.
So I wanted to return to this teaching of the makil, and then also the question is reinforced. It's pressed by the use of the term hayitzeh me'atba, which literally means going out from the imprinting. So at first, through Tam Vadas, the heart and in its natural state, the nefesh elokis is bound up together with nefesh habahamis. So the heart, it's part of our very fiber and being. Unfortunately, nefesh habahamis, they're bound together. And through Tam Vadas we can't rid the heart of the containment of evil, but through it takes this fiery love, this Abba Rabba that's beyond Tam Vadas, that enables the going out, the Yitzhak Me'atba'ah, the going out from the imprinting of this intertwining of the Nefesh Elokis and the Nefesh Bahamas. Is that a fair taich?
I think that's exactly what I just said.
Okay. I mean, I don't disagree, but I definitely use different words.
I mean, the imprinting I wouldn't use, because I use more the wiring, the teva, the wiring of the heart, but that's just a matter of semantics, maybe. But that's what he says here.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Okay. Good.
I'm sorry.
So
I'm just being very literal here.
yeah. Okay, we'll stop here. The end of the paragraph on page 14.